Hey there, Matt Easton, Scholar Gladiator. So regular viewers of my channel will know that I'm a big fan of Bowie knives. I know that some people prefer that I say Bowie knives. I don't care, call it Bowie, whatever. But I particularly like Sheffield made Bowies. And you know, I'm English, and perhaps something that lots of people don't necessarily realise, because the Bowie knife is such an iconic American knife, is that a huge proportion of Bowie knives, actually even in the 19th century, were made in Sheffield. There were lots made in Germany as well, but Sheffield Bowies were particularly famous, and they were shipped out to America in large quantities, and the British sort of knife making industry realised there was a big market for these things from about the 1830s onwards. So they were particularly popular from 1830s, 1840s, basically after the Alamo, right the way through until the Edwardian period, so after 1900 really. And there were different styles. It's a very interesting field of study. I might do a video actually talking about the different styles of Bowie knives that you find in the 19th century. I'm not an expert, but I'm learning, and I probably know enough to make a video about. And I do buy antiques when I can. Antiques are super expensive because Bowie knives are pretty popular, pretty fashionable, much like Colt revolvers. They have an iconic status, and so people are willing to pay top dollar for Bowie knives in antique auctions. However, there are makers still making good quality Bowie knives today. Obviously there are newer makers, but there are some makers in Sheffield still. In fact, there's a number of very good knife makers still in Sheffield, some of whom have a kind of continuous tradition of knife making going back into the earlier 20th century, in some cases even back to the 19th century, and that's true of some German makers as well in Solingen. But what I've got here is, I'm not going to talk about this one specifically, but this is a typical style of Sheffield Bowie knife, and just to delineate what makes it typically Sheffield style is particularly that very square bolster. As you see, the guard is part of it's almost like a ferrule, but it's not, it's a bolster, part of the guard section that's very square, very rectangular. I like, as you know, I like rectangular grips. I like flat grips because you get very good edge alignment with them, and this is a particularly nice knife made in Sheffield by Carr and Naylor. I think it probably dates to about the 1970s or 80s, something like that. I'm not even sure if Carr and Naylor are still in business. I don't think they are, but anyway, it's stamped made in Sheffield, Carr and Naylor, guaranteed, hand forged, and as I say, so these weren't milled or ground blades. These were mostly forged blades. They were finished with grinding, but with a traditional method of knife forging that went right back to the 19th century, in a master and apprentice relationship as well. So it is a continuous tradition. So whilst many of these knives are made today, or in this case made back in the 70s or 80s, they are very much part of a Victorian tradition, a 19th century tradition. But the styling had changed a little bit. Not to say you don't find Bowie knives of this style in the 19th century, you do, but they weren't necessarily that common of a type. But what I have here is one made by another Sheffield maker in modern times that is very much a Victorian style that is not popular today. Now, just before I show it, this is a particular style of Bowie knife which was popular in between about 1850 and 1890, so for a fairly long period. But modern people have different aesthetic ideals, and so modern people prefer this really big, chunky, beefy handled kind of Bowie knife. And well, modern people prefer all sorts of things that 19th century people would have thought were horrible. And it's funny, when we look at historical periods, this is always a factor. You know, you look at certain styles of medieval arms and armour, or clothing even, and it might look ridiculous or ugly to the modern eyes, but it's kind of irrelevant because it's what they thought looked good, and equally they would think some of the things we think look good now, they would think look horrible. So, you know, for example, a Fairbairn Sykes dagger, a medieval person might think it looks incredibly ugly, although most modern people I think quite like the look of it. But if you look at bollock daggers, for example, from the 14th to 16th centuries, a lot of modern people think they look ridiculous, but very clearly they were the most popular style of dagger in that period. So this is the style of Bowie knife that is not popular today, but which I personally really like. Ta-da! And yes, it has a handle exactly like your fancy silver cutlery, and that's exactly where it comes from. I think the inspiration probably was for people who liked their sort of fancy silver handled cutlery and wanted a handle like that on a Bowie knife blade, and I really like the combination. I absolutely accept that lots of modern people think this is horrible and think it is the most ugly thing ever, but I think they're great. I've always really liked them, and I actually don't know any of my friends who like these. They all think that they look grim. But so this is made by J.E. Middleton and Sons of Rockingham Street, Sheffield. So it's got a good carbon steel Sheffield made blade, again part of the Victorian knife making tradition, continuous tradition, and in this case it is very much a 19th century style knife. Most of Middleton Bowies are actually made in a relatively modern style, and although they are Bowie knives and look basically like 19th century examples, like some 19th century examples, there are some key differences in that to me they look a little bit modern, and I like this because it looks like an actual 19th century one. And I kind of like the idea that someone wants a Bowie knife, you know, a weapon that's essentially for self-defense. Okay, a lot of people go, oh, Bowie knives were tools, and they were, you know, they were like kukris and machetes and hatchets and everything rolled into one. And whilst that's kind of true of, if we look at kind of Hudson Bay type trade knives, when we're looking at the late 19th century, it's very clear from the etching and decoration on the blades and what the words say on the blades. For example, they're often called things like the Patriot's Defender and things like this. It's very, very clear that by the mid 19th century, by about the 1850s, these were generally regarded as weapons of self-defense. They were life preservers, self-preservers. I've even seen one etched with the Patriots, you know, self-preserver. They've got these great mottos on them, and very often they'll have American patriotic mottos etched on them. Of course, during the US Civil War, you sometimes get Confederate or Union mottos on them. And ironically, a lot of those were etched and decorated in Britain because Britain traded to both sides in the American Civil War and sold all sorts of stuff to America throughout the 19th century. So, Enfield rifles most famously perhaps, but so I particularly like this because it's a real 19th century style knife. But if I wanted to get one of these that was an original, you know, say from 1870 or 1880, something like that, if I wanted to get one of these original in nice condition, I'd be looking at hundreds of pounds, possibly into the thousands. Whereas you can get a modern made, I actually bought this second hand, but I got you can get a modern made one for, you know, 150, 200 pounds. I actually got this for less than that because I got it second hand, but they are really nicely made things. Modern steel, of course, which in many cases is better than 19th century steel, but with the aesthetic and looking like brand new, looking how the 19th century ones would have looked when they came straight out of the workshop. In terms of ergonomics, I actually find it's funny I mentioned the Fairbairn Sykes dagger earlier, because I find this very similar in the hand. It's a very narrow handle, but it is quite good at staying in place. I mean, for any of you who've used cutlery with that style grip on, you'll know what it feels like. And actually, when you use, especially a saber grip, so you take your index finger and your thumb, and they hold the neck, as it were, of the hilt right up behind the guard there, and then you kind of hold the rest. Or it's more like a foil grip, actually, I'd say, rather than a saber grip, quite loosely in here. It's very much a thrust-centric weapon, and even with big Bowie knives, you should be predominantly thrusting, but you know, with the cut when usually in defensive actions, cutting on an incoming arm, this kind of stuff. Obviously you've got cutting if you need to use it as a tool, but generally speaking in fighting, they are, despite their shape and despite what some movies might show, they are predominantly thrusting weapons, I believe. And in this case, this is very much wants to be used like a Fairbairn Sykes dagger, and I actually find it really comfortable. I like small skinny grips, they suit my hand, and you know, if you've got a background in sport fencing or doing foil or even small sword, for example, then this type of grip will feel really comfortable to you. And even if you look at gaucho knives, and some people think that gaucho knives were the inspiration for Bowie knives actually, which I think is fairly plausible. Gaucho knives usually have equally fairly skinny grips up at the top here. They usually bulge more at the bottom, but they're quite skinny at the top end. Anyway, so I find this ergonomically very nice. I don't have any problems with it at all. So I really like this thing, and I like the idea that it's fancy. It's a bit of bling, so it's not just a self-defense spike. It's a self-defense thing where a person's gone, I want to look like a gentleman wearing this. I want to look like a gentleman when I'm stabbing you to death. Yeah, cool thing. Not that easy to get hold of these days, but you know, some of you maybe haven't even seen this style of Bowie knife before, but there we go. I like it. I understand lots of you won't, but an interesting example. And of course, if you are interested in traditionally made Bowie knives, don't underestimate what the Sheffield makers can still do. There's not that many of them left, unfortunately. It's a dying industry, so support Sheffield knife makers. Cheers, folks.